All right, guys, moving on to part 14 now, where we're looking at the vintage limiter. So the vintage limiter is actually loosely modeled after a real. It's not like the vintage compressor, where it's kind of a mix, a digital hybrid, where wasn't really emulated after anything specific. But this is loosely modeled after the Fairchild 670, a very, very popular, sought-after compressor and/or limiter. So the 670 was a tube-based compressor and limiter. So if you are coming from Ozone 6 and you were a user of the Maximizer's tube mode, that has been added into the vintage limiter. So those presets will still open. So if you're wondering where that went in the Maximizer, like, oh my God, that left, I like the tube mode, just use the vintage limiter to do that. All right, so the key features of this is it's a pretty basic limiter. You have the ceiling, threshold, and character. You don't really have a whole lot. It's not a very advanced limiter in terms of things where you can set release and attack time and all that sort of stuff. But you do have different modes. You have these analog, tube, and modern. And these different modes are going to affect the sound. So analog is going to be a fast attack with a variable release time. And this is nice if you're trying to tame and control the bass response within a track. So think of this one would make it sound thick.
Here I am, happy in my own skin. After all my lessons I learned to win. Now or never's what I'm living in.
All right, the next one is tube. Now this is more closely modeled after what the actual Fairchild 670 did. It has kind of a variable attack and release time, and just adds a nice sonic vibe to it.
Here I am, happy in my own skin. After all my lessons I learned to win. Now or never's what I'm.
All right, and then modern is kind of a combination of old and new. It is an IRC limiter or filter limiting. It has variable release times, and it reproduces the transients pretty nicely. So it's a pretty cool. This is my favorite one actually on this.
Here I am, happy in my own skin. After all my feathers on my arms, I'm truth is then I got nothing left to lose. Climbing mountains and I love this view. I walk through the.
All right, so this threshold is going to determine in decibels the level at which the limiter will start to actually limit. The ceiling is going to control that maximum output. I would always suggest anytime you're messing around with the ceiling inside a limiter, especially in a mastering sense, don't have it pegged at 0, because you might approach digital clipping and harshness. So -0.1, -0.1, -0.2 usually is a good place. And then character, you have this character fast and slow. This is going to adjust the attack and release times of the vintage limiter. So you notice that there were no attack and release times. I mentioned that it's pretty, the interface is nice and easy to use. So if you set it down at a really fast release, and its attack and release would be 0.0, and then this would be slower.
I'm proud of my scars.
And this can actually have a very drastic effect depending on what mode you're on. The analog one, it tends to, even the fastest response does not seem nearly as fast as the modern, because of the circuit or the emulated circuits, quote unquote circuits, that's going on in each mode. So like I said, pretty basic limiter, but it is quite nice. It's not my favorite, if I'm giving my personal opinion on it. It's not my favorite module inside of Ozone 7. I don't think it's incredibly musical. If you have a really loosely compressed and lightly compressed track coming into the mastering stage, I think it's nice, but mine usually hit pretty hard coming from mixing. So I don't have a lot of haven't had a lot of success using this. It colors usually my mixes in a way that I'm not a huge fan of. Last thing we got to talk about though is this true peak limiting. This is going to tell the vintage limiter to take into account not only the levels of the digital sample of the sound, but also the analog signal that's going to be converted by the actual module itself. So it kind of, what that is, that's kind of like marketing buzzwords to it, rounds out the sound a little bit nicer. So it makes it rounder to my ears. All right, guys, there is the vintage limiter inside of Ozone 7. I'll see you in the next video.